Check 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8.
Did you say coffee? It's like that afternoon lull time. I hate sitting like right behind people because then there's like video footage of you making a funny face. You can still sit in this row. Yeah, they're all for us. I just don't want to have my face on the video. Go away.
He's like, yeah. I can tell that you.
So you do want to stay for a second here?
Huh?
You do want to stay for a second?
Yeah, if Ken is going first. Ken is doing the statement. And then,
Please be back first. I'll
Okay.
just be at the back. So.
all right. All right. Don't leave without me. We're leaving together.
Just making sure.
Okay, we're leaving together.
Hi, nice to meet you. If you want, and one of us, I don't know if you have any friends here. Friends behind you or wherever you feel comfortable.
Yeah, so we've all become fast friends. So it's really not 2 hours. In fact, I brought a computer and all that for 2 hours in between meetings. But then, but it'd be great. It'd be awesome.
Yeah.
It's nice. We've all shared neighbors. So initially I was like, and then I was like calling. She calls it court stuff.
It is hard stuff.
And this is really, I mean, it's not a joke. It's just like,
Yeah. You got this. At least you have your, something.
well, that's because I asked them when I came in, like, hey, you guys have stuff. I'm like, all kinds of people do this.
No.
Because I will take them on a long road. All these things. And they'll say, boot, desert, 5 minutes, you're up. So at least we have the, just remember, have to push the buttons.
It'll be fine. They can also, they'll also push the button for you.
But,
Hi, Rohini. Rohini, you and I talked on the phone. Adelaide, we talked about vendors. Yes, absolutely. I'm good. How are you? Of course. Yeah. No, I'm so, we're here to support you guys. Well, we're not testifying. We're here in solidarity. Yeah, please.
I have to have my chapstick there because I'm like,
But yeah, I'll also just bring down on that as well. REC, just push through. No, thank you so much. Yeah. No, I can the cage for those two. I know, but
unbelievable. But like they're all this one.
hi. I'm Adelaide. I work for the Second Art Defenders.
Oh, okay.
Nice to meet you as well.
And we're all
Hi, I'm Casey. What are you doing? Hi, I'm Jillian. I'm associate with the Defenders. Thank you so much. Thank you. Yeah, so nice to meet you. He likes to say it wasn't that way when he was. But lowest coach like first 90s. But then he went, then he became his wife was like, what are you doing? And then he became a prosecutor. And then she passed. Yeah, so it's one of the good ones. It's, sometimes helpful too to me to have that experience as a defense. Because then you can, how they play the game. It's really great. It's good to have supervised. Hi, I'm Jillian. Nice to meet you. No, of course. When you come down to Earth, yeah.
I was thinking you are.
Oh, yeah, no, that's, yeah, that is how I feel about it. That's true.
Yeah, so do you guys have locally?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, better pray. No, I totally get it. I mean, on the one hand, they are, everyone's going through the process. So if you look at it from that, just that little bit of
Good afternoon. This hearing will come to order. I want to welcome everyone to this hearing of the Military Personnel Subcommittee on Domestic Violence in the Military. We are here today because domestic violence has become a forgotten crisis in our military. It's been 15 years since a DoD task force analyzed domestic violence within the military, yet we have seen unsettling warning signs since. Within the last few months, DoD reports have highlighted concerning failures in our service's domestic violence prevention systems. The DoD has not responded urgently. Today, we will hear from 3 survivors of domestic violence in the military who are bravely coming forward to share their experiences in the hopes that others may be helped. Their stories are riveting, they are painful, and they are real. Because we lack data that is recent, plentiful, or granular, we must rely on survivors, advocates, and experts to help us understand the unique challenges of dealing with this crisis within the military. Major Leah Olszewski is still on the run from a violent abuser. Air Force officials at every level refused to help her, despite knowing of past incidents. Kate Ranta found justice in the civilian, not military court system, but only after her violent ex-husband, who was allowed to go free and retire from the Air Force, shot her and her father. Rohina Hughes and her son Jay were verbally and physically abused by her husband, who as a JAG used his knowledge of the system against her. These incidents impact victims, families, communities. The DoD must learn to believe survivors and take action based on their claims and evidence. Denial, favoritism, and a complex bureaucracy cannot shield dangerous perpetrators. Domestic violence is not unique to the military. According to the CDC, 1 in 4 women and nearly 1 in 10 men have experienced intimate partner violence in their lifetimes. And as with civilian domestic violence, there is no, quote, typical, unquote, military domestic violence case. That means policy must account for and address a wide range of potential aggravating factors. Adverse childhood experiences may create a propensity for domestic violence. Poor role models can make it hard to peacefully resolve conflicts. Law enforcement providing access to child care and early education, military leadership, Congress, and the criminal justice system all have roles to play. But we must also mitigate the factors of military life that can exacerbate the risks of domestic violence. Families cope with new responsibilities, frequent moves, and tough challenges. Service members may be consumed by military duties and struggling with post-traumatic or other stresses, and a thirst for high-risk behaviors after multiple deployments. Military spouses are often isolated, underemployed, and struggling to make ends meet, living far from friends or family, and unfamiliar with local resources. It's unfortunately easy to see how these conditions can make domestic violence possible, more dangerous, and persistent. When young men and women join the military, they become our responsibility as one of our nation's most precious resources. We are equally responsible for military families who sacrifice along with the service member. And we are responsible for military children because exposure to domestic violence has long-term effects, and because military children are disproportionately likely to join the military themselves. I believe the military takes this problem seriously, but it's clear that leadership needs to address this threat with renewed urgency. Commanders at every level need to make combating domestic violence a personal, and I underscore that, a personal priority. In recent years, Congress has added a UCMJ domestic violence criminal article, required new reporting on DoD's prevention and response systems, and explored expanding special victims attorneys to cover domestic violence. There is far more to be done, and I hope to learn about some of these options today. Today we will be joined by 2 panels. The first will consist of military domestic violence survivors and experts. On the second, we'll have DoD officials responsible for designing and implementing relevant policies. We will focus on three main questions during today's hearing. First, are we taking the crime of domestic violence seriously enough? Who does it affect, and what happens to them? Second, how should we prevent domestic violence, reach out to and care for survivors, and deal with perpetrators? Third, what do current DoD programs look like? What are their strengths, and how can we further improve them? Before I introduce our first panel, I'd like to offer Ranking Member Kelly an opportunity to make opening remarks.
Thank you, Chairwoman Spear, for having this very important hearing today. And this is an issue that I've been engaged in since I was a city prosecutor in 1999 at the misdemeanor level and later as a district attorney at the felony level. And I know of no more serious issue than domestic violence and what it does to families and lives and all those around who surround. I wish to welcome both of our panelists to today's hearing. I particularly want to thank you three survivors of domestic abuse and for your bravery and your willingness to share your stories here today and the issues in your story. Domestic abuse is a serious national issue. On average, nearly 20 people a minute in the United States are physically abused by a partner. Unfortunately, the military is not immune to this national problem. Domestic violence in the military has lasting negative effects on not just the family in which it occurs, but also in the military community as a whole. It is imperative that the Department of Defense have a comprehensive prevention and response program to ensure that military families have the resources needed to identify and prevent domestic abuse, and that survivors of domestic abuse have the legal, medical, and behavioral health resources needed to rebuild their lives and those affected by these acts. As a former district attorney and city prosecutor, I prosecuted domestic violence crimes and have put domestic abusers behind bars. I'm a firm believer in education and transparency in order to prevent domestic violence situations. And when I say education, it's not just for the victims, it's for peers, it's for the abusers, it's for the chain of command. It is understanding what domestic violence is and is not, understanding what the solutions are, how to get to credible solutions, and it is very important, and it is a long-term process to educate all those involved so that we know exactly how to deal with this problem, because it is not acceptable that it stays even. We want it to get better. I know firsthand how difficult these cases can be to prosecute and how traumatic the process can be for the whole family. Many times they use power of separation from friends and associates and families to keep them from having a helpline to reach out for. They use financial resources and lack that the victims have. They threaten that I'm the only breadwinner. I understand all these unique situations which many people in America just quite frankly don't understand, and it is an education process that commanders at all levels need to understand. From ongoing counseling to financial insecurity, it is imperative that the family receive the support they need after the criminal case has concluded, not just during, but after. No matter how many resources we provide survivors, however, our primary goal should be to prevent domestic violence to begin with. I'm encouraged that the department has a new prevention plan of action, which is a comprehensive approach to prevention, including a focus on awareness and early intervention. I'm also encouraged that the Domestic Violence Response Program leverages the entire scope of community-based resources. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses who are survivors of domestic violence about their experiences and what can be done to improve the process from your point of view. I'm also interested to hear from the other witnesses on the first panel, some of who have partnered with the Department of Defense to ensure their comprehensive prevention and response programs benefit from civilian best practices. Finally, I look forward to hearing from the Department of Defense on the current program and any new initiatives that may improve the domestic abuse prevention and response program. Thank you, Madam Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Kelly. Each witness will have the opportunity to present his or her testimony, and each member will have an opportunity to question the witnesses for 5 minutes. We respectfully ask the witnesses to summarize their testimony in 5 minutes, if at all possible. Some of your stories are riveting, and we will be somewhat lenient in that regard. Your written comments and statements will be made part of the hearing record. Ms. Kate Ranta, survivor and advocate. Ms. Leah Oshweski, survivor. Mrs. Rohini Hughes, survivor and advocate. Ms. Arlene Vassell, Vice President of Program Prevention and Social Change at the National Resource Center on Domestic Violence. Mr. David S. Lee, Director of Prevention Services, Prevent Connect. Mr. Brian Club Coordinator, Military and Veterans Advocacy Program, Battered Women's Justice Program. Thank you all for being here. Ms. Ranta, would you like to begin?
My name is Kate Ranta, and I am a survivor of domestic and gun violence. My former spouse, Thomas Maffei, was a major in the Air Force. In 2009, we were living in officer housing on Fort Belvoir. It was there that he began to show increasingly abusive behavior toward the children and me. He controlled every aspect of our lives. During this time, Thomas was also pushing to retire. We were moving to Florida when the retirement came through. But as the time approached to close on the house we bought there, he still wasn't retired. So he said that he would forge orders and give them to those responsible for arranging PCS moves. He said they wouldn't even question it, and he was right. We moved into our new home in early September 2010. Thomas's behavior became erratic. On January 2nd, 2011, he took it to another level. He picked a fight with me, then locked me out of our bedroom. I heard the sound of a gun chambering. Terrified, I dialed 911 and ran out of the house. Then I heard the garage door open, and out he came, holding our toddler, who was only 2. He got into the car, and I jumped in with them. He raised his fist at me. His eyes were black. And he told me to get out of the expletive car or he would punch me in my expletive face. I jumped out and he sped off around the corner. When I ran back to the house, the police were there, and so was Thomas. He was giving his military coins to the officers, telling them that he was a veteran. He wasn't, he was still active duty. And that he had survived a Humvee explosion in Iraq. He had never deployed. To them, he was a hero, and I was the hysterical wife. The next day, I got a temporary restraining order, a civilian one, and he was served. I called his commander at Andrews Air Force Base, Colonel Timothy Applegate, and told him about the domestic violence incident, about the restraining order, about his soldier not being in Virginia, but in Florida, and about the fake moving orders. He was quick to get me off the phone. He knew he was in trouble, too. He'd had no idea that Thomas wasn't even in Virginia for those past 4 months. Thomas also knew he had to get back to Virginia, which was what he did. In the meantime, I was connected with OSI and reported the situation to them as well. As a result of that, Thomas was moved out from under Colonel Applegate and placed with a new commander, Lieutenant Colonel Michelle Ryan, at Bolling Air Force Base, as OSI began its investigation. He was to remain on Bolling with check-in time, so they knew he had not left the base. During the months he was held at Bolling, Thomas went AWOL 2 different times. Both times, I got calls from Lieutenant Colonel Ryan that he had not checked in as he was required to do, that they could not make contact with him, that my family and I should go somewhere where he couldn't find us, as she couldn't guarantee that he wasn't on his way to Florida. Both times they found him a day or 2 later, but she gave excuses about his whereabouts. OSI completed its investigation in mid-March. They were looking into spousal abuse as well as fraud. I was contacted by an investigator who let me know that they'd found him guilty of both and would be recommending court-martial. I was relieved. That was until he told me that Thomas's punishment could actually be up to his command, and that there was a chance that nothing would happen to him. Shortly after OSI closed the case, Lieutenant Colonel Ryan called me. She said that they had handled it administratively and that Thomas would be retired at the end of March. I literally begged her to reconsider. She said he'd served 25 years and charging him would cause him to lose his pension. The military lifted the restraining order they'd put on him, and he was released out into society. A year and a half later, after months and months of civilian court hearings, Thomas showed up with a 9mm Beretta, ambushed me at my apartment, and shot through the front door. My father and I were standing inside the door, pushing against it, trying to keep him out. My son, William, was standing just behind us. Thomas pushed his way in and shot some more. A bullet went through my right hand. He shot my dad point blank in his left side, and I thought my dad had died. A bullet also went through my left breast, just missing my heart. Another bullet went into my dad's left arm, leaving it paralyzed. Thomas did this in front of William, his own son, who was only 4. His own son who screamed, "Don't do it, Daddy, don't shoot Mommy." By some miracle, we all lived. The 3 of us got out of the apartment and Thomas surrendered at the scene. He spent almost 5 years in jail before we had the civilian trial, where he was found guilty of premeditated attempted first-degree murder and sentenced to 60 years in prison. So we saw justice on the civilian side, not the military side. All of this was avoidable. I hold his command fully responsible. They knew he was dangerous, but instead they chose not to do a thing about it. Domestic violence in the military is rampant. There are tons of Thomas Maffeis in their ranks. I hope this committee will be as appalled as I am about what happened to us and will take steps to change this, take care of our own culture in the military at the expense of women and children whose lives are at stake. Thank you.
Thank you for that very compelling testimony. Ms. Olszewski? Pronounce it for us so we...
Olszewski.
Olszewski. Okay.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Leah Olszewski. I'm a major in the Army National Guard, entrepreneur, daughter, sister, and one-time intimate partner of an Air Force Senior Master Sergeant Eric Carden. Senior Master Sergeant Carden misled me from day one. Initially, under the impression he was still at Air Force Special Operations Command, I later learned he had been fired and kicked out of the unit 2 years earlier in 2014 for violence and abuse on service members. Abuse that, according to several airmen, should have gotten him kicked out of the Air Force entirely. The Air Force then sent Senior Master Sergeant Carden to Afghanistan for a year, where his commander told him if he did not stop his behavior, he was going to end up in jail. In 2016, Senior Master Sergeant Carden was rewarded with a leadership role at Travis Air Force Base, California. One of his fellow non-commissioned officers warned Travis leaders of the Senior Master Sergeant's history, but was dismissed. They said they knew. Within 9 months of being at his Travis Air Force Base unit, Senior Master Sergeant Carden was fired and kicked out again, this time for 3 significant acts of violence on service members. Once again, he was shuffled and made someone else's problem. No counseling, no court-martial, no consequences. A month after being fired, Senior Master Sergeant Carden and I moved in together, and the severe abuse, emotional and physical, began. Over the next 6 months, I was a slut or a whore just like other women, should know my place as a woman. He isolated me, was jealous, enraged, and explosive. He constantly threatened me to break my neck and bust my teeth out. There were 5 physical assaults, including strangulation. Then, on October 11th, 2017, my world came to an end when, preceded by 3 days of emotional abuse, he kicked me in the abdomen with both of his feet. Among other things, he knew I was pregnant. I called the police and he ran from the house. Over the next 3 days, I miscarried. When command learned of the physical abuse, they simply said, "Run away, Leah, he's doing you a favor." For the next 11 months and to this day, I have battled the Air Force to do the right thing. Every entity on Travis Air Force Base, from command to family advocacy to security forces, failed me. They just waited on the Senior Master Sergeant to retire. I asked for help from command at Joint Base McGuire-Dix Lakehurst, Scott Air Force Base, and directly from former Air Force Secretary Wilson, General Goldfein, and Chief Master Sergeant of the Air Force Wright, with no response or a minimal, entirely ineffective response. The Air Force Inspector General later dismissed several of my complaints. As they always had, the Air Force turned a blind eye, sometimes actually actively supporting Senior Master Sergeant Carden instead of holding him accountable. On September 1st, 2018, the Air Force honorably retired Senior Master Sergeant Carden. No demotion, no court-martial, no consequences. Now he laughs in court about the miscarriage, abuse, and my suffering, and has continued to terrorize me by skipping over 48 other states and moving down the road from me knowing I was here. He had no friends, no job, no family, no clearance, no reason to be here. He violated his restraining order in April and is retaliating against me still by trying to ruin what's left of my Army career. I live in fear, heavily burdened every day. The Air Force is responsible for enabling and emboldening Senior Master Sergeant Cardin over many years, for putting service members and communities at risk, and for all of my losses. If they'll do this to me, they'll do this to everyone and anyone. If Air Force leaders won't even listen to its own members regarding Senior Master Sergeant Cardin, let alone me, and years of workplace and domestic violence equate to nothing in their eyes, how many others are there, and what does it take? What does it take? Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Ms. Olszewski. Mrs. Hughes.
Honorable members of the Armed Services Subcommittee, staff, respected experts, and witnesses present here today. As a former citizen of New Delhi, India, and now a U.S. citizen, I am a proud military Air Force spouse, a former spouse. I humbly and thankfully submit my testimony while being grateful to you for this opportunity to share my story on behalf of countless military families, my families, and my son, Jay Hughes, who is with me here today. I'm a patriotic military spouse who served as a key spouse program manager for various Air Force units, and I have been a proud stay-at-home mother for the last 20 years while serving our military, our community, and my family. My former husband, Major Matt Ernest Hughes, is a prior Navy reservist, a former active duty U.S. Air Force JAG Corps officer in Afloa at Joint Base Andrews, and currently has a private practice in Rockville, Maryland, while still serving as an active reservist at an unknown location. Major Hughes has had 4 tours of deployment. On December 24th, 2014, our world shook and was changed forever when my husband wiped out all our accounts, canceled our credit cards, and made stop payments on all outstanding checks. He followed these actions with an email to me stating erratic and controlling demands with a timeline attached for each demand. These demands clearly defined us as slaves to be objectified and owned, not to be loved, not to be respected, and not to be honored. Examples of Major Hughes's behavior was repeatedly laughing while degrading, tormenting, enjoying his cruelty towards us. Major Hughes would twist our son's nipples while laughing, forcing his thumbs inside an open bleeding wound on Jay's shaking knee, laughing and stating that it didn't hurt him. He did this repeatedly. He neglected our unsupervised son while being intoxicated for several hours, which traumatized Jay, who believed his father was dead. On other abusive occasions, Jay would lock himself in a bathroom in fear for his life. Another instance, Major Hughes dumped a large box of food on top of our sickly daughter's feverish body. After years of abuse, we sought medical and mental health assistance. When he discovered this, he made us feel guilty and prohibited us from going to hospitals and doctors, even after our daughter's failed attempt of suicide. Then he demanded I pay rent for continued shelter in our home or accept his offer of $200 per month for sex in exchange for shelter while he collected BAH. We were forced to perform all of the household duties while he leisurely worked on his body. He would continuously yell in our faces, calling us losers and dumb and lazy, even when I miscarried or was giving birth to our children. On December 31st, 2014, I contacted Mr. Peter Katzen at the Pentagon's Legal Assistance Office, who encouraged me to contact the Afloa commander, Colonel Thomas Zimmerman. My husband was reported to Child Protective Services in December 2014 for child neglect and abuse by our counselor, formerly at Meyer Clinic, Fairfax, Virginia. He has been reported again since 2015 by Walter Reed National Military Medical Clinic, Joint Base Andrews Family Advocacy Program, and Fort Belvoir Adolescent Inpatient Unit. And yet I am being falsely accused of parental alienation. In March 2015, Major Pamela Bluford at the Joint Base Andrews Family Advocacy Program, FAP, began reviewing the complaint submitted by Dr. Kumlang at Walter Reed and began treating me with hostility during an interrogation in front of Ms. Mary Young, the victim advocate at FAP present at that time. She questioned my intentions and motives for seeking mental health assistance while repeatedly telling me these types of allegations could negatively affect my husband's career in the Air Force. Major Hughes, as deputy in AFLOA, told me my marriage would likely be headed towards a divorce while stating that this was a civil matter, disregarding the reported evidence of abuse. Additionally, she stated that as long as my husband was paying rent, even though we chose not to return to the home due to our fears of our safety, he was providing adequate support and would not be mandated to provide any money to us for food or lodging while we continued to be homeless. In July 2015, Major Hughes separated from active duty in the Air Force to go to the reserves. He utilized his separation orders to terminate our lease prematurely under the provisions of the Service Member Civil Relief Act, forcing my family into homelessness for almost 2 years. There were many other documented events of abuse, none of which supposedly met the Joint Base Andrews FAP abuse criteria. However, it did meet DoD's abuse criteria by 100%. After each abusive episode, Major Hughes would drink, deny his abusive actions and behavior, words and events, grin and laugh. This forced us to begin documenting series of abusive events. We learned new terms such as narcissism, sociopath, gaslighting, and coercive control and parental alienation from our therapist concerning Major Hughes. After several months of being ignored by my husband's command, AFLOA, interrogated and treated unprofessionally by FAP, Major Pamela Bluford continued to deny me the written documentation of the finding. I was informed by Ms. Mary Young at Joint Base Andrews FAP that this unprofessional behavior and aggression was a normal occurrence in the FAP office towards victims all the time. I'm sorry, may I just grab some water?
Sure, and then would you be able to sum up?
Yes, ma'am. This former JAG has also utilized his position in exploiting the Service Member Civil Relief Act in a civil court in front of a former JAG judge, forcing me to pay almost $30,000 in legal fees, which I cannot afford. This is a black eye on our U.S. military. It is the invisible scars that forever haunt me and my children through the failed suicide attempt for my daughter and my son's suicidal ideations. Major Hughes prohibits him from seeking medical attention. I fear losing my son to suicide while he eliminates all his assistance that he desperately needs. It is through our faith in Christ that we are able to sustain and be here in front of you today. Unfortunately, my story is not an isolated set of events or incidents. Many military spouses experience similar abuse, desertion, abandonment, but are afraid to come forward because they are groomed not to expose their abuse while they're being silenced. Thank you for this opportunity today.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Hughes. Ms. Vassal?
Good afternoon, Chairwoman Spear, Ranking Member Kelly, and distinguished members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to provide testimony on the importance of prevention. I thank the committee for holding this hearing to discuss life-saving prevention practices and strategies. As mentioned before, I'm the Vice President of Programs Prevention and Social Change at the National Resource Center of Domestic Violence, with over 20 years of experience responding to the needs of survivors across the nation. Our mission at the National Resource Center is to strengthen and transform efforts to end domestic violence. Since its inception in 1993, NRCDV has played a key role in providing collaborative learning and resource development to end and prevent domestic violence. The purpose of my testimony is to share strategies for prevention that could be implemented by the military. These strategies can help prevent domestic violence before it happens, benefiting not only military families, but all our communities across the country. The prevalence data has been shared, but what I do want to emphasize is domestic violence causes profound and enduring health, economic, and other consequences across the lifespan, so it doesn't stop. Additionally, studies focusing on children exposed to violence finds that 1 in 5 children witnessing parental assault also leads to increased risk of experiencing and/or perpetrating domestic violence as adults. I also want to emphasize that children are resilient. It's not a cliche, and can bounce back with the appropriate age development and culturally specific interventions. Prevention is much more than education, and it goes beyond the individual. We must use a public health approach to prevent first-time victimization and perpetration from happening. Violence can be prevented and its impact reduced in the same way that public health efforts have prevented and reduced pregnancy-related complications, workplace injuries, infectious diseases, and illnesses resulting from contaminated food and water in many parts of the world. Sexual violence and domestic violence are more complicated than other public health issues because of the intentionality of harm and the social stigmas associated with their occurrence. Primary prevention efforts, though, impact modifiable factors associated with domestic violence, such as reducing acceptance of violence, challenging social norms, practices, and policies that support or reinforce gender-based violence. When violence occurs, there's a sense of urgency to intervene, support victims, hold abusers accountable. We know these things are necessary, but to stop violence before it ever happens, it is vital that we recognize that the connections among issues of health, safety, economic security, and other factors affecting well-being can increase public understanding of the complexity of the violence. This understanding, according to the CDC, the Center for Disease and Control and Prevention, will help inform primary prevention efforts. Our approach at the National Resource Center on Domestic Violence is awareness plus action equals social change. We have seen success in using this formula, and many organizations and communities have adapted this approach. Awareness, increased knowledge, action, we develop and disseminate resources and tools to proactively prevent first-time victimization and perpetration by interrupting the cultural rules, norms, and constructs that it supports. Based on evidence, my expertise, and experience collaborating with various military communities throughout my career, my recommendations for the military are as follows. Some already mentioned. Develop and implement a comprehensive domestic violence response and prevention plan. Create and foster a culture of equity, dignity, and respect, promoting health and safety. Create policies and practices that support survivors, always believe survivors, and hold abusers accountable so that all service members know that domestic violence is not acceptable and will not be tolerated. Develop and maintain collaborative relationships with community-based practitioners, social justice organizations, local domestic violence agencies, and state coalitions. Collaboration is key in ending and preventing domestic violence. No single agency can do this alone. Equip service members all levels with tools to recognize warning signs and encourage safe and effective bystander interventions to reduce or prevent violence and assault. As we continue to enhance responses and offer survivors and their families services that are survivor-centered and trauma-informed and life-saving, we must continue to hold abusers accountable while also creating an accessible pathway for healing. And most importantly, we must commit resources to addressing the root causes of violence and prevent perpetration and victimization from ever happening in the first place. As mentioned before, effective prevention programs require cross-discipline and multi-sector collaborations. Thank you for your support and interest in prevention efforts, strategies, and evidence-based practices. Preventing violence means changing our society and its institutions, eliminating attitudes, beliefs, behaviors, environments, and policies that contribute to violence, and promoting those that create thriving communities for individuals to live, play, work, and worship. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Fassel. Mr. Lee.
Good afternoon, Chairwoman Spear, Ranking Member Kelly, and members of the committee. I also want to thank the survivor panelists for their courage to speak and really highlight the importance of the need of changing the culture in our society, changing the culture in our armed services so we no longer accept domestic violence and make those changes that can create a place where people can live their lives to their full potential. I am the Director of Prevention at Prevent Connect, a national resource center dedicated to advancing the prevention of domestic violence and sexual assault. Through my experience, we've been able to see many ways that prevention does work and can be able to make a difference. I'm pleased today that we're addressing both survivor perspectives and prevention strategies for our nation's armed services. It is necessary to be informed by survivor experiences to be able to define how we're going to go ahead in being able to create the changes we need to do. It's essential to respond to the needs of survivors in a trauma-informed manner, to assert the dignity of all people, and to hold those who have committed abuse accountable. However, those responses after violence has occurred are not sufficient to prevent such forms of violence from happening in the first place, nor are they sufficient to prevent them from happening in the future. Only with an intentional investment in prevention will we be able to change the culture that creates the condition which allows domestic violence and other forms of violence to continue. Prevention requires much more than awareness. Prevention is about creating a culture that challenges violence and the behaviors and the attitudes which contribute to it. We can learn from several other efforts that have been taking place. In the Department of Defense's 2018 annual report on sexual assault in the military, the report noted that historically, activities aimed at preventing sexual assault have primarily centered on raising awareness about the crime. These approaches have likely contributed to increases in victim reporting and use of support services, but civilian sector research suggests that awareness programming does not translate in the kinds of long-term behavior change required to prevent sexual violence at the organizational level. This is also true for domestic violence. In order to do this, we must invest in prevention in the armed services to build a prevention infrastructure. There are many elements this should include. We need to have committed leadership for not just addressing domestic violence, but its prevention, a commitment to be able to look at creating that change of culture that's going to name the problem and take action and be willing to be able to prevent it. It's going to require staff who receive good training in prevention, in understanding the issue, and having staff that are dedicated to prevention beyond just responding to the needs of those who've experienced domestic violence. It's going to require collaborative and engaging partnerships with other prevention efforts. We have to look at issues of domestic violence as we're also looking at sexual assault, sexual harassment, and other mental health issues. And it requires collaboration with local, state, and national civilian domestic violence prevention efforts to build cohesive prevention messages and programs that are going to work off each other and build off each other. There are many prevention strategies that can be able to make a difference and that or have an impact that we can see, and we've been dedicating our work and seeing the work that's taking place. Not much has been taking place within the military itself, but we have worked with families, workplaces, schools, and colleges and sport where we're seeing the beginnings of the potential for change. And there's several opportunities. Part of it, for example, in the Blue Shield of California's 2019 report, Life Course Framework for Preventing Domestic Violence, they talked about we have to mitigate and reduce childhood exposure to domestic violence by investing in prevention approaches aimed at improving the outcomes for parents and their children. In the Centers for Disease Control's 2017 publication, Preventing Intimate Partner Violence Across the Lifespan, a technical package of programs, policies, and practices, they highlight strategies that can be able to prevent domestic violence. This involves engaging influential adults and peers, in particular, doing work with engaging men to be able to re-examine masculinity so we can create a new form of manhood that's dedicated towards promoting gender equity, not male dominance. For the armed services, we should look at the lessons learned in sport and fraternities, for example, where we've been able to make changes. We need to create protective environments, and that the armed services can take efforts informed by school-based and workplace initiatives to make shifts in their culture to enhance safety, promote healthy relationships, and respectful boundaries. And we can strengthen economic supports for families. Efforts that strengthen household financial security and work supports are part of a comprehensive way to be able to prevent domestic violence. Domestic violence shatters lives and families and adversely affects the capacity of the armed services. With an investment in prevention, we can make a difference in the lives of service members, their families, and the community. As we continue this journey towards prevention, we build healthy relationships, healthy families, and healthy communities.
Thank you, Mr. Lee. Mr. Clubb?
Yes. May have to use your mic here. I would like to thank you, Chairwoman Spear, Ranking Member Kelly, and the members of this committee for the opportunity to speak on this important topic. I'm the coordinator of the Military and Veterans Advocacy Program for the Battered Women's Justice Project. I'm also an attorney and a retired Marine officer. My program is funded by a grant from the U.S. Department of Justice Office on Violence Against Women. And through our work in the field, there are a number of issues we've identified that straddle the prevention of and response to domestic violence in the military and impact safety. And in the interest of time, I'd like to summarize a number of issues that I've identified in my prepared testimony. The Armed Forces Domestic Security Act requires that civilian protection orders, or CPOs, be given the same force and effect on military installations as they have in the jurisdiction in which they are issued. However, it's difficult to enforce a CPO if key personnel in a military installation do not know of its existence. Registration procedures for CPOs can ensure that installation commanders and military law enforcement know about them, and that knowledge is crucial to enforcement. But despite the fact that the DoD policy permits such procedures, my experience is that it's rare that installations have them. Commanding officers also have the authority to issue military protection orders, or MPOs, to any service member under the command and have wide discretion as whether or not to do so. Commanding officers sometimes issue only verbal orders that do not provide protected parties with a written copy, nor placement in the service member's record book, which are both required under DoD policy for written MPOs. In addition, this policy avoids the DoD requirement to submit MPOs to the National Criminal Information Center. This requirement was instituted in response to federal law, which mandates that commanding officers notify appropriate civilian authorities when any party to an MPO does not live on a military installation. Unfortunately, the recent DoD IG report did not look at this particular issue, let alone the service's compliance with the actual federal law and what it directs the military to do. Another concern about MPOs is expiration dates. Federal law states that MPOs shall remain in effect, quote, until such time as military commander terminates the order or issues a replacement order, unquote. Several years ago, the Department of Defense began a process to revise the standard MPO form. However, that process has stalled, and in the interim, DoD has not issued any guidance regarding the issue of expiration dates. Arguably, as a result, commanding officers violate federal law every time they sign an MPO with an expiration date. There's also the issue of firearms. Much research exists on the use of firearms in domestic violence homicides, and firearms are the most common manner of death in civilian as well as military domestic homicides. Federal law and many state laws restrict the possession of firearms by those who are subject to CPOs. However, we have no data as to how or if the military is enforcing personal firearms restrictions against service members, against civilians who are military property and subject to those orders, or whether commanding officers include firearms restrictions when they issue military protection orders. One issue that's not in my prepared testimony that I think has been raised by the testimony of the survivors here today is deferential treatment to senior service members. I oftentimes hear from individuals, to include some of the members on this panel today, in which it appears as if commanding officers and the whole military response is much more deferential to individuals of senior rank, as well as those individuals who are coming close to retirement. The last issue I'd like to address is collaboration between military installations and the local communities in which they are located. Collaboration is crucial, as military-related victims and their abusers are often navigating two different and sometimes conflicting systems. These two systems must actively work together, effectively share information, and evaluate their processes in order to ensure that negative consequences don't occur and to increase safety for victims and others. DoD policy does direct collaboration between military officials and civilian counterparts, but beyond military FAP programs and their civilian counterparts, my experience is that the levels of collaboration between military installations and local communities as a whole is at best spotty. Collaboration takes a willingness of all parties, and DoD policy by itself cannot enforce those in civilian communities to do so. Our organization previously partnered with the National Center on Domestic and Sexual Violence and DoD on a multi-year project to create a military-civilian coordinated community response model. That work identified the difficulties in establishing and maintaining military-civilian collaboration to include jurisdictional issues, different reporting systems, confidentiality, and of course, cost. I look forward to answering any questions that you, the committee members, may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Clubb. Thank you all for your outstanding testimony, and to the survivors, such extraordinary courage and such painful memories that you had to live through once again. But in so doing, you've provided us with a great deal of understanding of how ubiquitous this issue is. And as Mr. Clubb said, for those who are senior service members or near retirement, you are poster survivors of what happens under those circumstances. Let me just start. Mr. Clubb, you referenced the use of firearms. If someone in civilian life now has been convicted of domestic violence, or even if they have been charged but not convicted, there is a means by which you can take their firearms away for a period of time, the red flag laws being one of the examples. Does it not have a negative impact on the service member if they can't use a firearm in the course of their duties, and therefore makes the commander less likely to want to impose an MPO?
Chairwoman, there are two specific federal domestic violence statutes or statutes within the Federal Gun Control Act. There's the Lautenberg Amendment, which provides a prohibition for ammunition and firearms for anyone who is convicted of a misdemeanor crime of domestic violence. There's also a provision which restricts both possession and ownership of firearms and ammunition if an individual is subject to a qualifying court order, specifically in which there's a domestic relationship, intimate partners, due process, et cetera. The Lautenberg Amendment does prohibit individuals' lifetime. There's no exemption for that. So if an individual is convicted of a misdemeanor crime and domestic violence and they serve in the military, they eventually will be processed out because of their inability to carry a firearm. The qualifying court order prohibition does not have that same response, or it does not require through DoD policy any sort of eventual discharge for that reason. There's also the official use exemption that allows government employees, to include military service members, who have to carry a firearm for the performance of their duties in order to do that and not violate federal law. It's not been my personal experience that and most of that is hearing from victims and survivors and from attorneys and advocates that are working on these issues directly, direct cases in which there is a commanding officers not wanting to issue military protection orders for that reason. But at the same time, I think there's a lack of knowledge among commanding officers in general.
Thank you. To each of you extraordinary women, if you had one thing that you would like to have seen changed in your set of circumstances that would have improved your ability to deal with the trauma of domestic violence, or one thing as you look to speaking out on behalf of domestic violence victims who come after you, what would that be?
Well, for myself and my family, I think the pivotal moment was when OSI closed the case and I was told that it would be up to his command whether to do anything about it or not. I was naive. I'm not from a military family. I had no idea how to navigate this system, and it made no sense to me. But as I said at the end of my statement, I do hold his command fully accountable for the eventual outcome, because I had done everything right. I had reported. I had gotten the protection order.
OSI had recommended.
Right, and OSI had recommended a court-martial for him, and I do believe that had he been held accountable and had the military taken care of things on their end, you know, the lethality that eventually happened on our end, almost death, could have absolutely been avoided. So just the idea that, okay, well, he served 25 years and his pension would be affected, to me was like outrageous, and he should have absolutely been held accountable. Being found guilty of fraud and spousal abuse and court-martial recommendations should have absolutely happened, and I really do believe that we may have avoided near death.
Thank you.
Likewise, on the command issue specifically, because going back many years, command failed to do anything with him previously. I think my goal is still to have him court-martialed, which can be done from what I understand without bringing him back to active duty. And again, that goes back to the failure to court-martial him years ago really stems from command more than anything. Now, I had multiple issues with security force investigators never investigating, OSI not knowing for 7 or more months, just a wide variety of failures. But in the end, it was command going back many years that failed to do something that could have prevented me from ever meeting him potentially, or could have mitigated or completely prevented his abuse of me.
Mrs. Hughes?
I'd have to agree with my other colleagues in addition to the command definitely being held responsible, the failure of their role in stepping forward and recognizing the reported abuse, the evidence of abuse, in addition to FAP's failure in stepping forward and implementing and executing the DoD's abuse criteria. I don't believe that that was done in my case, and that seems to be the main common thread among many other military spouses who are groomed to, first of all, not bring the abuse forward because this fear is instilled in us, and we're groomed to believe that it'll destroy the service member's career, but then when we do come forward, it's completely screened out by concluding that it didn't meet the abuse criteria, shutting down each and every resource that we could possibly obtain in seeking justice or protection for ourselves. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you. Mr. Kelly, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman, again. And first of all, I want to we talked about strangulation. And when I was the district attorney in Mississippi, I was very helpful in trying to get the law changed so that it became a felony in Mississippi, because that is one of the most controlling behaviors that a domestic abuser can have, is strangulation. And so I guess my question to you guys, if you know the answer, if not, I hope DOD is listening, I'll ask it later. Is strangulation a felony, domestic violence in the military?
Congressman, I know that with the addition of the UCMJ article, I believe it's 128B, that is establishes domestic violence assault, I believe that strangulation is included in that. But of course, it depends on how it is prosecuted in the military. Clearly, if it's non-judicial punishment, that's not a conviction. And
thank you. I won't get to some more, but
okay.
Number one is we got to make sure strangulation at least has the ability to be prosecuted as a felony. And second, I want to give my wife is a victim assistance coordinator back home for the DA's office, and so we're very involved and engaged in this. And one of the things that Mississippi also passed a law on while I was district attorney that is if you're charged with domestic violence, misdemeanor or felony, you're not allowed to plead that down to some other violation that does not include domestic violence. So you can't plead to something that is not domestic violence, so that the Lautenberg Amendment does kick in. Because it is very important that when someone has committed a domestic violence act and they've been convicted of that they lose their ability to carry a firearm. And then, and part of the problem is, quite frankly, ATF would not prosecute or do anything with those things when reported when I was a prosecutor. ATF would not come take the guns away when I would call them and say, this guy is a convicted domestic violence guy that has a firearm, and they would not come take it. And we've got to enforce the laws that we have. Rather than looking for new laws, let's enforce the laws that we have also. because I think that is helpful to enforce Lautenberg to not be able to carry a firearm forever once you're convicted of a felony or of domestic violence. How helpful would it have been to you survivors had the military, when you talk about pensions for senior, if they would have said, if convicted of domestic violence, whatever degree of pension you've earned to this point as a senior service member goes to your spouse and children to take care of them, but you don't get it. How helpful would that have been to you three?
Yeah, so extremely helpful. So like I said, I don't know really the ins and outs of the military. I was only married to him for 3 years. My understanding was that as the spouse, I was not really entitled to any of his pension because we had to be married for 10 years. But we do have a child together. And my child hasn't seen a dime of his precious pension that they so wanted him to keep. So yeah, it would have been extremely helpful if that had been an option.
Because that financial instability or the ability to pay your bills and take care of and have a place to live. I heard your story. To have a place to live, that he has to look for a place, not you. He has to look for a place, not your kids. He has to look for a place to live. And those are so we need to make sure that we're educating folks so they know that if someone leaves, it's not the victim. It is the abuser who has to leave. And now, if they're found innocent and those things, then that's a whole different ballgame. But until that point, once the accusation is made, we need to take care of our victims and make sure that they have a place to live, that their health care, and that their pay continues, whether that be through whatever. Would those type of policies at DOD help you as a victim until resolved in finality, and then also not being able to plead down to something less than domestic violence? Would that be helpful?
So I know for me, sir, it's a little bit different, but luckily there's a California Victims Compensation Program, which I've been able to get some assistance from. So for me, it's a little different, obviously, but I did incur, I went into huge debt leaving out of California and things of that nature. I don't know that I'm actually really eligible for anything, but so for me, it doesn't really apply. So I just wanted to.
And then the final thing, and I guess I just got time for a comment, but I want to make sure that we understand how to get either civilian protection orders and military protection orders. There needs to be a policy of who in the chain of command get those, and there be a validation that they have to be, and they're required by the violator to turn those over to the chain of command, which becomes a crime if they don't do so. And with that, I yield back, Chairwoman.
Thank you, Mr. Kelly. To your point, 70% of our service members live off base. So the likelihood of a CPO being identified by the perpetrator and reporting it to the command is somewhat, I think, challenging. It seems like we need to put something in place where there's a sharing of that data between the two, the civilian and the military.
Chairwoman, there is a DoD policy that
You're supposed to-
requires
yeah.
service members to reveal or tell their command when they're not eligible. But whether or not, especially younger service members, really understand that if they have a protection order against them is debatable.
Right. Right. Ms. Davis for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Excuse me. Thank you all. I really appreciate your testimony. I wanted to just start with Ms. Vasil for a second because you listed a number of best practices, resources, and as I'm sitting here listening to those, I'm wondering whether our survivors are sort of thinking about those too and then feeling so frustrated because none of those things seem to be there for them. And so where's the connection? I mean, because we often talk about best practices. We want to change the culture. We want people to be able to go for help when they need it, and maybe even if they're not sure they need it, but they have a sense that something is wrong in their situation. And I know it was mentioned that we need to connect some of the training, the culture, and yet we're talking about this, and it's been a long time that we've been talking about this, and that's my frustration. So the question that the chairwoman asked about pointing to one thing that would have made a difference, Could you point to a systemic problem that we could fix that would prevent this from happening to anyone else? Do you feel that you answered that question, or is there something else in this that is just a miss?
Ma'am, I believe, as Mr. Kelly mentioned, we currently have excellent provisions in the legislation. We currently have an incredible DoD abuse criteria. I don't believe that it needs to be improved. I believe it needs to be executed. I think there's a major impediment and gaps that we need to recognize today, that unfortunately the commanders, either through the lack of knowledge or the lack of desire or the lack of, I say this respectfully, their arrogance, they're not executing what Congress and the military has already put in place. So even though I appreciate the best practices from my colleague, I think it's imperative that we look at the Service Members Civil Relief Act. It's an incredible federal law placed and set to serve the military families, yet it's being exploited by the service members. So what can we do to tighten it? So I don't believe that new practices are going to be necessarily a negative. They would certainly help, but I think focusing on what we currently already have and executing it and holding individuals and commanders accountable is where the key is. Because I think one common thread amongst all three of us is the commander's failure to act and hold the service member responsible. Thank you, ma'am.
Anybody else want to comment? And how would you communicate that as a spouse? I know that one of the issues is the fear of somehow interrupting a spouse's career or a partner's career, whatever that may be, and somehow that being such a wholly negative and fearful thing to do. What would you change?
So I personally was not very afraid of the possibility of something happening to his career. I really felt like he needed to be held responsible. He had done this to me. He had done this to my children. I was in the right in the sense that I had done the things that I was supposed to do, and he wasn't being held accountable. And I think the frustration comes with, as we've said, going to the commander, nothing happening, but then where do you go from there? And not knowing how to navigate. And it's just incredibly frustrating, and you feel very, very helpless. And it's just like an entire cultural shift that has to happen. And I don't, other than speaking out and telling my story anywhere and everywhere, I don't know how to do that.
If I could quickly touch on that. So in my case, I was concerned about protecting him. That's often the case with domestic violence victims, but I also thought about my own career with the military and how to tell my commander, hey, this is what's going on, and it all came down very, it's just difficult for me. So I think domestic violence victims that are service members have their own set of issues on top of being a spouse.
Do we need better helplines for fear of that's not but being able to identify someone higher up? You don't feel that's a resource either?
So I made phone calls. I relied on friends that were Air Force service members who cared about what I had been through to contact and get email addresses for the next chain of command, the next chain of command, the next chain of command, although they did nothing as well. So I think it's a good idea to know where you can go, but if different entities aren't really sharing that information because they have something to cover up or an
And you
agenda.
think you could have, had this been only in the civilian sector, you think where would you have gone in that case?
Right, I'm not sure. I've never been a domestic violence victim, so I wouldn't say that I had clarity on that as well, but surely within the military, which they're supposed to have higher standards, I would have expected more.
Thank you. I know my time's up. Maybe we'll come
Ma'am,
back to
just
that.
lastly, I'd like to answer
Ms.
your
Hughes,
question.
we're going to come back to you.
Oh, thank you.
All right. Mr. Mitchell, for 5 minutes.
Thanks very much, Madam Chair. We owe spouses and children of service members a great deal of gratitude and attention for the sacrifice they go through while people serve. People like the individuals you described today, they're not effective service members either. Let's be honest about it. We do not want those people serving in our military. They're dangerous. They don't represent our military well. They don't represent our nation well. So the idea that somehow we're protecting their career, they shouldn't have one. That's, in my opinion, something we need to address in terms of policy discussions with the Pentagon, if need be legislatively. If you're a domestic violence perpetrator, you would do that to other people, and that's a violation of our morals. So I don't care about their career. Let me ask you a question. It seems to me that there's a system in place. You went through the process, but it just flat out didn't work. Is that a correct assessment, ladies? Go ahead, of course.
Sir, this is an answer in conjunction to answering Mrs. Davis's. When I contacted the federally regulated domestic violence hotline to discover and seek out any sort of resource that the military had failed to provide me because they only deferred me to calling 211 when we were going into homelessness, I was told that as a DV victim, I would be deferred back to the military installations FAP for further assistance, which had already turned me down and told me that they were not going to be able to do anything. The only thing that they offered for assistance was counseling, which I had already been receiving from Walter Reed, sir.
Well, let me ask each of you. Have you gotten any information that any of the commanding officers that you contacted to the process in any manner were held accountable or questioned about this at all by their senior commanding officers?
Yeah, I'll answer for my case. Like I said, he was retired. To my knowledge, Colonel Applegate is retired in 2013. Nothing ever happened to him. As far as I know, it got swept under the rug that he was made aware that Thomas Maffei was AWOL and not even living in Virginia and had gone to Florida. And then Lieutenant Colonel Michelle Ryan, my understanding is she works at the Pentagon, and I think she also retired too. Nothing ever happened. After we were shot, I sent his mug shot and media links to both of his commanders and sarcastically thanked them for protecting their soldier instead of the soldier's wife and children, as I had warned, and I received no response.
And if I could say also, I actually filed, so SecAF office, Lieutenant Colonel Tyler Lewis told me in September 2018, after I found out they had honorably retired Senior Master in Cardin, that I would have to show all the failures of the Air Force before they would relook him. So I filed a Security Forces OSI and a command complaint, which is the command complaint alone was about 60 pages. Initially, the Air Force IG, SAF IG, had said that they were concerned for my safety and wanted me to file a complaint. Well, within 2 months of filing that command complaint, they basically dismissed it and they said, this case is closed, we consider this case closed, and they would not look at any of the commanders who had failed years before, during my time, and thereafter, going all the way up to the SecAF office.
Yes, sir.
Many of the issues that these survivors have addressed, I think, goes back to commander discretion, and we understandably give military commanders a wide range of discretion on many issues. Regarding domestic violence, that discretion in many cases involves lack of prosecution, concern about ruining the service member's career, et cetera, some of the things that we've discussed today.
Let me stop you a second, sir, and I appreciate that. You don't have discretion. They should not have discretion when it comes to abusing your spouse or your children. Mm-hmm. What the hell is that discretion? And I think, Madam Chair, we should have the ranking members from the Pentagon, not come over here and have a conversation of how they're holding their commanding officers accountable for failure to deal with this. Because there's a system there. We have money in the system. We have their policies in place. But they don't want to damage someone's career. They don't want to damage their own career. They're damaging our military. They're damaging families. It's unacceptable. And if they don't like that criteria, we can find other officers that want to have an Army or armed services that is respected in the world and in our own nation. But to abuse your spouse, and my time is out and I apologize, to abuse your spouse or children because you have a psychological issue, whatever other reason you may justify it, is unacceptable in our military, it's unacceptable in our society, but we're sure not going to tolerate it. So we need to have them come over here and explain to you what they're going to do to hold them accountable, because it disgusts me. And I appreciate you all coming. Thank you.
Mr. Mitchell, thank you for your comments. What has played out here is really abuse of command discretion. And in all of your cases, a determination was made that the service member should be protected over the family member and the children. So much like we've done with sexual assault, we may want to take these cases up to a higher level so that you don't have that just inherent conflict of interest that exists because the commander knows the service member. If it goes up to another level, that might.
Madam Chair, in my opinion, until we have that higher level of command and we hold a commander accountable for their career, for failing to manage their forces, we're never going to get there. I agree with you, and it needs to be something that if you won't manage your own personnel, then you don't belong being a colonel or whatever other, and you go. As soon as someone's held, a few people are held accountable in the system, and you understand this, Ms. Kelly, as soon as some people are held accountable, then in fact they'll take it seriously. And we need to insist that they're going to be, or we'll simply find some other officers to lead our military. It's disgusting. I thank you for your deference.
Thank you. In addition to holding some of the DOD officials accountable, I think what we also need to do is bring the Inspector General in, because the Inspector General for DOD has already identified a number of failings in each of the services in terms of complying with DOD regulations on appropriately identifying, fingerprinting, handling these cases in a manner that's appropriate. Yes, now to our colleague, Mr. Cisneros, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Thank you all for sharing your story today. Mr. Clubb, I just kind of want to follow up on the same thing about the commanding officer discretion, and you had mentioned something earlier, but non-judicial punishment. Mm-hmm. How likely are the commanding officers, going to deal with this through NJP rather than kind of actually reporting or trying to do it through a court-martial?
Well, I have not seen DoD statistics or service statistics on this the way the statistics that we've seen on sexual assault, for example, that may have been cited in this committee in the past. I think part of the reason for that is that until just last year, there wasn't a domestic violence article in the UCMJ, and I believe there's difficulty in tracking. I've not served as a judge advocate in the Marine Corps, but it's my understanding, talking to those that are serving within the services, that there are ways of flagging cases as they go through the system, even before there was a domestic violence article, to identify who the victims are and identifying cases as falling under this criteria. But not seeing those statistics from which cases are going to court-martial, which cases are going to NJP, or declining prosecution or any action, I can only speculate on that.
Does the commanding officer have any responsibility? And like we said, 70% of military personnel are likely to live off base, so this domestic violence is likely to happen off base, out of the commanding officer's jurisdiction, with civilian authorities. When those individuals are brought to the command, what responsibility does the commanding officer have to take action on that?
Well, commanders can prosecute cases that happen off installation, and I think part of what I referenced earlier about military-civilian coordinated community response is the coordination, collaboration, sharing of information, and determining who is going to take cases in which either the civilian authorities could prosecute, military authorities, or potentially both, and deciding the best place to handle a case judiciously and effectively.
Okay. Mrs. Hughes, I want to follow up on something you had said earlier too, right? You said as a military spouse, you're kind of groomed, not to come forward, not to report domestic violence, to not really say anything. And I think this is part of that culture that's, I guess, instilled in you, right? That we all agree that it needs to be changed. But who is this that, that's instilling this in you and says, no, don't come forward? I mean, is it other spouses? Is it, Air Force personnel? Is it Air Force service members? Who is really coming, who is this culture that's doing this, that's telling you not to say anything?
Sir, thank you for asking that question because I think it's a very pertinent question. I'm the former key spouse for the Air Force in addition to the key spouse program manager. I worked very closely with the first sergeants and the commanders and the wing commanders. And I saw time and time again that as we collaborated in the key spouse program manager, the culture there seems to stem from the military personnel that are grooming these key spouses to ensure that the victims of domestic abuse do not come forward, do not share the information with the first sergeant or the commander because it's going to ruin the career. And then the first sergeants are coming alongside the victim and reiterating that information, saying that now if you report this, let me remind you what the consequences will be. You're not going to get any BAH, you're not going to get any type of housing assistance either. You'll be kicked off base. So these are the kind of fear tactics that are being instilled in the victims that are the military spouses and children as well. Thank you.
And I think I have time for one last question, but hopefully I don't butcher it too bad, but Ms. Ozorski? Yes, Orzowski, sorry.
Good enough.
So you weren't married to the
That's
master, correct, right?
No, we lived together. We had shared bank accounts, shared lease.
So just one thing, and I know this is something that we've talked about a lot, throughout Congress, and we talked about the boyfriend loophole, being that you weren't married. Did you ever come to a situation where they were saying that, hey, well, you're not married, this isn't really domestic violence? And can you talk about that a little bit?
Right. I think that was the thing, and that's why the commander said to me that day, hey, just run away, Leah, he's doing you a favor, because he thought, oh, this is so simple. They're just boyfriend, girlfriend living together. So I did feel that the Air Force really looked at us solely as intimate partners. I guess according to family advocacy, that's what we were. And then they feel once an intimate partner, always an intimate partner. But again, I didn't really get any benefit of being a service member in terms of even Special Victims Council, which is primarily for sexual assault, which is great. But so there were issues with that. It was really challenging. But now, of course, that he's filed, a bogus IG complaint on me because I was an 04. He's saying that now he's filed an IG complaint in the past few months saying conduct unbecoming of an officer because I'm an 04 and he was an E8 at the time. So he had no problem back then. SOCOM commander had no problem back then with any of this, and now it's being filed, and my rank is now being used against me to a degree. So when it's convenient, we're just intimate partners and boyfriend, girlfriend, and when it's not, suddenly military service comes into play.
All right. Well, my time's expired. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Cisneros. I have one question before we go on to Ms. Escobar. The Family Assistance Program, Family Advocacy Program, excuse me, is going to be testifying next. Each of you had interactions with the Family Advocacy Program. So after you answer Ms. Escobar's question, I would like for you to think about what didn't work for you in the FAP or FAP. Okay, Ms. Escobar for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and thank you for your continued focus on issues that need to be brought to light and that need transparency. And many thanks to our witnesses, especially for your courage and for your willingness to tell your story and to help us address an issue that very badly needs to be addressed and as best we can. Because of your experience, I'm wondering if you could share, and this is open actually for all of you, any of you who would like to answer this question, where have we failed you? Where are some specific instances where we could have and should have done better so that we can look to rectify this in the future so that wherever it was that we failed you, we can try to fix it. And it's open to anyone who would like to go first.
Okay, I'll touch on it really quickly because I know everyone else has something to say too. So I kind of believe in what Mr. Mitchell had mentioned about bringing the leadership, calling them out. I believe that does matter because it seems like a lot of things that go on are from the top down, and really it needs to be from the bottom up. So something like the Air Force really needs to involve victims in terms of changing things. So I don't think that a lot of quote-unquote leaders will do anything until they are actually called out. And I think that's a huge, huge thing to start with that process and then purge them from the military system, as he mentioned.
Thank you.
Yeah, in my situation, I was basically frozen out. I had no resources. I had no way of knowing how to navigate, what to do next. I was just fortunate that I had military wives that helped me, point me in different directions on who to report to and what to do. I had no guidance at all from his commander. His commander just wanted it, to sweep it under the rug. So, they just wanted to make it go away, and that was a humongous failure.
Ma'am, as far as I'm concerned, I see it as a major command failure because I believe that the command can hold FAP responsible to upholding the DoD's abuse criteria because the commander has an enormous amount of influence in these CRB hearings that are taking place under the FAP umbrella, which unfortunately is failing the system. So I say this very humbly and respectfully. If we're going to put service members in command positions that are leadership positions, as Mr. Mitchell mentioned, can we please ensure that these individuals have the moral grounds to uphold and lead such critical issues such as sexual assault and domestic violence and domestic abuse? And if they don't, or if they choose not to, then I humbly request the subcommittee to assign an oversight committee which oversees these commanders and holds them responsible. And that committee would be under your subcommittee that would work collaboratively with these commanders at each military installations. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.
And just hearing from the survivors today and throughout my career, and again, thank you all so much for your ongoing courage. The best practices that I had mentioned earlier were more focused on prevention, right? Preventing the violence from even happening in the first place and creating a culture within the military installations with like zero tolerance and it will not happen, perpetration will not happen, victimization will not happen. But hearing from the survivors and survivors that I've continuously heard from, what I would say is policies, practices, day-to-day practices need to match policies. Abusers need to be held accountable regardless of their rank, like Mr. Mitchell had mentioned earlier. Responses to survivors, if we're going to talk about incident, what happens after an incident occurs, should be survivor-centered, should be trauma-informed. The survivors that are sharing with us today, this should be an ongoing process. Whatever is being enforced or developed should be informed by survivors throughout the entire process, not after the fact to say, well, would this work? So I think engaging survivors throughout the process, listening to survivors about what works, what doesn't work, and with enhanced responses and prevention, collaboration with practitioners, with preventionists, with domestic violence programs, I think would be another best practice that I would talk about. I've coordinated projects that included installations and domestic violence agencies that resulted in a toolkit for installations and for civilians. So just talking about collaboration. It sounds like it's not helpful, but it works, both for prevention and for intervention. And so being survivor-centered, being trauma-informed, and hold perpetrators, abusers accountable.
Thank you. Unfortunately, my time has expired. Thank you.
So the question on FAP, can you give us, 30 seconds of what FAP did or did not do for you?
I didn't even know about it. Actually, in your office today was the first time I'd even heard of FAP. So that's a failure. I had no navigation, I had no resources, I had no idea where to turn. So I can't even say that they failed me because I didn't even know about it. So obviously there's some link missing there.
All right, thank you.
I'm sure there's people that are like me.
Mr. Oshusky.
Yes, so I actually filed a family advocacy complaint with AMCIG, and they found 5 of 6 failures to have occurred. So I did not learn of FAP either through anybody other than my own efforts, through the VA actually on Travis Air Force Base. Then family advocacy failed to include evidence. They ignored the strangulation, miscarriage, you name it. They never reported to the commanders or shared their information. That unrestricted aspect didn't even occur. So yeah, I find family advocacy to be kind of a, I want to say a joke, but it's bad.
Thank you. Mrs. Hughes.
Ma'am, in my particular case, my cases of abuse in 2015 were never opened. I didn't discover this until I contacted someone at Lackland Air Force Base. And then finally, the abuse cases were opened in 2019, only to come to the same conclusion that it didn't meet the abuse criteria. To me, I'm being told repeatedly that FAP is not an entity to adjudicate. It is just an entity to provide resources. However, I disagree from my experience that that is exactly what's taking place.
They adjudicated and didn't provide services.
That is correct, ma'am.
All right. Mr. Lee, you had said in your testimony that holding days of recollection of or weeks of domestic violence awareness is in part what we tend to do as opposed to actually drill down and provide the prevention. I want to give you the last word for the panel.
Right. So every October, we declare Domestic Violence Awareness Month, and indeed, many places will have a proclamation, and there'll be a announcement that goes out. What we need to be able to do is it's about making that investment in prevention and being able to look at that at 12 months a year, about how leadership is going to be involved, about how we're going to not just educate, but be able to change the structure of, and look at how we can use military culture to be able to say that this is not acceptable. When we see a culture that, and we heard so many stories of denial and not being able to, and not about accountability, the values of the military are about the values that are aligned with saying that we stand with each other to make sure that we are going to be stronger together, and not a way that's going to be sacrificing people in the greater mission. So we need to find a way to use those messages, and there are prevention programs that we can do that I've described in my testimony that we can be able to do, that we've been doing in college campuses, that we've been doing with high schools, that we've been doing with sport, that we need to be able to start looking at how we can implement that in military settings so we can be able to change that culture from the lowest rank to the highest officers to be able to make that change.
All right. Thank you very much. You've been outstanding witnesses. We're now going to take a couple minutes recess so we can reset for the next panel. Thank you again. Ready? Now we are moving on to our second panel, and I'd like to welcome Mrs. A.T. Johnson, the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Military, Community, and Family Policy at the Department of Defense, and Mr. Kenneth Noyes, Associate Director for the DoD Family Advocacy Program, Department of Defense. Ms. Johnson, I think you have a statement.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you. On behalf of Mr. James Stewart and the cadre of dedicated and expert professionals in the Family Advocacy Program, thank you, Madam Chair, Ranking Member Kelly, and members of this distinguished subcommittee for your unfailing support of quality of life programs that keep our service members and their families strong and resilient. Ensuring the continued welfare and well-being of service members and their families is a responsibility the Department of Defense takes very seriously, as family readiness is imperative to readiness of the force. I appreciate the opportunity to appear before you today to discuss the Department's efforts in addressing the serious issue of domestic abuse within the military community. Okay, tilt it up. Sorry. Joining me today is Mr. Ken Noyes, Associate Director from the Office of Military Family Readiness Policy, which is the policy proponent for the Family Advocacy Program. Before moving on, I'd like to thank the witnesses on the first panel who shared their personal experiences. Each of you has taken a traumatic, heartbreaking event in your life and turned it into a call to action. We hear you, and we will continue to improve our programs and services. You and all other victims of domestic violence deserve nothing less. We consider our prevention and response actions to be comprehensive. However, we recognize that domestic abuse presents human factor challenges that require continual training, education, and improvement in the effectiveness and responsiveness of our system. We cannot do it alone. We must and we will continue to work with our community and federal partners, as well as with leading experts in academia. While we continue to make significant progress in our efforts to effectively address and prevent domestic abuse within the military community, the Department is acutely aware that there is still much work to be done. We remain committed to the safety and welfare of our service members and their families, and can never forget that our families, unfortunately, are not immune from the serious national public health issue that is domestic abuse. We need and we welcome the continued interest and support of this committee and Congress in advancing this critical work. And with that, we look forward to your questions.
Mr. Noyes, do you have any? No. Do you have a statement? You do not. All right. I guess my first question, Ms. Johnson, is based on what you've heard in the last panel, what steps are you going to take?
First of all the testimony was absolutely heartbreaking. But what that does is that is a call to action to us. In these particular cases, I don't know the specifics, so in that regard, I would have to refer them back to the services for action.
Well, but first of all, two of the victims didn't even know that FAP exists. So wouldn't that suggest to you that you have a job to do in terms of making sure that all families know the services that are available at FAP?
Yes, ma'am. We have the overarching policy in the department, and then we work with the services to make sure that all resources are known. Unfortunately, it's not a perfect system, and we'll continue to work it.
Okay, that really doesn't answer the question at all. Just because you're the overarching authority and that the services all have to perform their function doesn't mean that you don't have a responsibility to demand of them that they do a better job of providing information, education, and maybe some of these survivors could be of some value to you in trying to determine how better you can make that available to victims. It would seem to me that one of the questions that was raised is FAP there to provide resources or to somehow make a determination as to whether or not a case should move forward or not?
Yes, ma'am. FAP is absolutely there to provide resources, but that is also the function to do a determination. And with that, I'm going to let Mr. Noyes address that issue.
Thank you, ma'am. Chairwoman Spear, I just want to address your question about outreach and the awareness of FAP. Certainly, we know that we have more work to do. Domestic violence is a scourge, and the work that we all have to do together as a community and as the DoD means that the best way forward is to ensure that prevention and response are coordinated efforts, so because we know that 70% of our families live off installation. In terms of how we make service members and their families aware of FAP, we have multifaceted awareness campaigns that happen in October, and of course we understand that that is a limited way in which we reach out. It is one way in which we reach out. We also work with the Department of Defense school system to ensure that they are aware of our services, and in fact they work with families every day and make referrals to FAP every day. We have child, youth, and family programs under the umbrella of military, community, and family policy who are also help us in our outreach to families so that they're aware of the services that we provide. We also work with law enforcement, with command, and with the entire coordinated community response, which is the core of how we address domestic abuse on the installations. And we work together to provide the awareness and the outreach that the community needs to understand the services that we provide and where we can be found. And again, we know that there's more to be done. Our services often come with some of the things that the victims talked about, and that is stigma, not being supported to move forward, and certainly that gets attached to FAP at times. And we have a lot of work to do to overcome the stigma for people approaching family advocacy program, along with our intersecting and other components that have the same challenges with people coming forward. In terms of your other question about accountability and whether we're a program that focuses on response, interventions, clinical services, support groups, and advocacy, that is indeed our mission. It is separate, it's a parallel process to the work that command, law enforcement, judges do in order to hold offenders accountable. We must ensure that FAP is seen as a social service provider that protects families working in tandem with the coordinated community response that supports them so that law enforcement, command, and the court, the military court system can hold them accountable for domestic abuse, child abuse, and neglect, and the other intervening forms of violence and harm and risk.
All right, Mr. Noyes, my time is almost expired. Let me just say this. 2 out of the 3 victims today didn't even know you existed. We've made trips to bases around the country, talked to spouses. Oftentimes, they don't know you exist. So you've got to look at another way of communicating with families, because the existence of your resource is there. It's being underutilized or not utilized at all. And I think that we need you to show greater accountability. I might also add that I think that trying to, when there is domestic violence, to bring counseling together for the 2 parents and try and keep the family together may not be the best strategy, and that appears to be one of the efforts that you continue to pursue, and I think that will be discussed at another time, but my time has expired. Mr. Kelly for 5 minutes.
I'm going to go back to the chairwoman's point. What additional resources, if any, are necessary by you guys to make sure that everyone knows that FAP is available? What do we, I mean, is there something we can give you, or what is a plan of action to make sure that at least they have knowledge that you exist? Is there a plan of action, or can we provide more resources that make that so that the majority of, I mean, some people will never know, but the majority of people will know that FAP exists and what it exists for?
Right. To be honest, I was not aware that people were not aware. I know that commanders know of FAP. Therefore, I think that part of the strategy is a reminder of the programs. When there is a FAP case, the commander actually oversees the Incidents Determination Committee. Would you like to?
Certainly. Yes, sir. We have a comprehensive prevention plan that expired in 2018, and we are working now to move forward to create that new prevention plan based upon the CDC socio-ecological model that other witnesses spoke about earlier. Part of that is a comprehensive communications plan working with the intersecting components that work against violence, so SAPRO, sexual assault and harassment, the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, looking at how—
All right, that's long enough, but here's the bottom line. If they don't know about it, it doesn't exist. And so figure it out. If you need more resources, let us know. But if they don't know about it, it does not exist. Going back, can you describe the community-based approach to domestic violence prevention and response, and what resources do you leverage to do that?
Yes, sir. The community-based response is we work with those folks outside the gate who also have programs. In some cases, there'd be a memorandum of understanding. In other cases, a memorandum of agreement. But our programs allow us to make sure that both on the base and off the base that we are able to offer our services.
And just as a suggestion, and whether or not you may already do it, and I hope that you do, but every base, active duty base, okay, has a local law enforcement and local community there. We need to be plugged in at the hip with their victim assistance coordinator, whether that be at the county or district level or city level, whatever that is, but we ought to be plugged into the hip so that nobody gets the gaps. You know, in the military, we always have to protect the boundaries. That's where the enemy always likes to attack because nobody's looking. And we need to do the same thing with our communities, our cities or counties, whatever that case may be. We need to be plugged in with their law enforcement and their victim assistance coordinators to make sure that they're not— we ought to be talking. And so if we're not, at least let's make sure we got a plan to talk to communities.
Thank you, sir.
You turned it on.
I just want to add that in terms of our connection to the civilian community and the partnerships that we have in order to protect domestic abuse victims and their families, the domestic abuse victim advocates that are funded through OSD funding work very closely to help support the needs of victims and their families, and they work really closely with community-based programs to ensure that they have the intersecting supports that should the DAVAs not be able to provide because of potential overwhelming need, or wherever there may be a small installation that's isolated that really needs the use of community resources to help serve people, that they are constantly working and reaching out, going to courts, helping them get MPOs and CPOs.
I've only got a minute left, so I want to get to the next point. I understand that those who have been violent in one context are likely to be violent in another. Okay, so people who mistreat soldiers or airmen or sailors are also likely to be the same ones who are mistreating their spouse. And so, what are we doing to identify and address violent behaviors at work that may carry over, not translate, or that translate into domestic violence over? What are we doing to train our commanders so that they see this bullying at work probably translates into bullying at home or domestic violence at home? What are we doing to inform and teach commanders and soldiers?
Right. I will need to take that back for the record. That is not an area that FAP has oversight in.
And with that, I just, we've got a long way to go. There's nothing more important, but I'm going to tell you, it all comes down to emphasis. And I would just say whether or not we can always have more education, but it's about transparency, it's about knowledge, and it's about educating. And so we've got some work to do to make sure that we educate the spouses and children to make sure that they know about the program and what resources are available. And with that, Chairwoman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Kelly. Not to beat a dead horse, but in meetings at the various bases, what we heard about FAP was that they showed up at the hearing with the survivor, and that was about the extent of it. So while you referenced that just now, I think it's so much more than that, and I think you're hearing that from all of us here today. Do you have any funding for research in your offices?
We actually do fund research. The services use our funding to also fund research that they identify based upon trends and gaps that they see in their communities. We work with multiple
All right, Mr. Noyes, what I think we want then is where that money has been spent and what has it been spent on, because I think we need to know more about when the domestic violence occurs. I've read one study that suggests it happens upon returning from deployment. And if that's the case, then we need to make sure there's the appropriate resources available to families at those particular junctions. Ms. Davis.
Thank you. Thank you both for being here. Mrs. Johnston, you said to the survivors, we hear you. And I think the question often that they're wondering is, do you believe us? And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts, or Mr. Noyes, about the extent to which, and we're talking, I would hope, about perhaps a relatively small number of commands that seem predisposed not to believe what survivors bring to them. Can you discuss that? Why would that be the case, if you think it might be the case?
I can't speak to an individual commander and what they would be thinking. What I can say is that there is a process by which folks come into command, and I would be hopeful through that process. In most cases, we will weed out these kinds of issues, but that would be where I would think that would be the place that we'd see that.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of FAP's connection to command and the way that they work with command, it is very focused on when a victim is being served, either clinically or through a domestic abuse victim advocate, that assuming that it's an unrestricted report, that the FAP manager or other personnel in FAP will tell the command based upon what they've learned in the case about the high risk or safety issues. And in that way, that's the way that FAP is working both with command and law enforcement, is to ensure that they understand the gravity of both risk and of safety, to ensure that appropriate measures can be taken on the command or law enforcement side. And that's where, in terms of thinking about the difference between FAP and the law enforcement and command system, where we support victims in sharing what is happening to them and the risk attached to that, so that then command and law enforcement and staff judge advocates will take it from there to hold the offender accountable.
Yeah, so you have a responsibility then to share that information that you received that could bring the behavior of a commander, for example, into question, to follow that through. Is that correct, or?
In terms of command response and responsibility, it is the service's responsibility to hold them accountable. Our role is to ensure that they understand what's happening with the victim and the offender in unrestricted cases. And I would have to defer to the services otherwise.
So, I think we're familiar, obviously, with sexual assault in the military in terms of restricted and unrestricted, but in terms of that responsibility to provide that information to the command, you're saying that if you have that responsibility only if it's unrestricted.
We have a responsibility of FAP first and foremost to the victim, being victim-centered and trauma-informed. If a victim has chosen a restricted report, she or he they have made that decision for themselves. Our responsibility is to ensure that the services, and therefore the services in monitoring the installations, follow DoD policy as it relates to restricted reports, and that is to provide services without informing command and law enforcement because the victim chose that.
Chose to do that. Okay, and that may be something that we should, perhaps in domestic violence, we should look at that as it relates to sexual assault as well. But my question also is, how do you get feedback? Because it seems that perhaps there could be a better way, like what we do in commands when we get the climate every year, every few years, right? I don't know whether families would necessarily fill out evaluation forms. Maybe that's better for research, the RAND Corporation, whoever, but how do you know? I mean, could you even say 10% of our families, 35% of our families have no idea what we do versus 50? I mean, how do you go about understanding the extent to which people know when they could use your services and that they're there, so that somebody, even first off, when I think actually, even when people are getting married, for example, because it's the services, it's an important thing for people to know what's available to me. What can I count on? How do people do that? What do you know about? Do you know how they feel about that?
So I would say that in terms of educating, which is, I believe, what you're asking, educating spouses and intimate partners about what is available to them, it's back to ensuring that the coordinated community response is working in tandem with us in each piece of their area of work. So mental health, hospitals, child and youth programs, education. We work together to ensure that each of us shares what we know about the other programs as well, and have a referral mechanism, information referral mechanism in place so that we can make sure that families and...
Yeah, I think my time is up. I'm sorry. I mean, military one source is one avenue perhaps, but...
Also the annual, not annual, but biannual spouse surveys, where we actually do survey the spouses on a variety of topics. So just this past year, not on the active duty, but in the reserve, we actually asked the question,
okay, maybe
do you know that VAP, have you used VAP? Do you know about the new parent support program? Have you used the new parent support program? So we should be getting those results, and we'll be able to better tell of the awareness of those.
So when those results come in, would you present them to the committee?
Yes,
Mr.
ma'am.
Kelly?
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up on Ms. Davis. She's talking about a command climate survey, which they do every time you have a new commander, and at the end of that. And so we need to look at something so that they at least have the opportunity to fill that out, so that we get some data on what they know and if what they know is true. So I don't know how we look at that, but that would be very helpful.
Great. Ms. Escobar for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So you sat through the first panel and you heard the survivors basically say that they had, 2 of the 3, that they had no idea that you existed. You heard one of the survivors say she had access to 0 resources. So having taken that information in and having heard some of the questions from some of my colleagues, what in your mind do you need to do to make this better?
Family Advocacy Program at DoD has the responsibility to monitor compliance with policy at the service level. I am committed, and I know Mrs. Johnston is committed as well, that in our oversight, we meet with the services regularly. We bring issues to them, they bring issues to us. We look at challenges and how we might better inform policy or practice. What other research might we be doing together? And this is a place where, as we're developing a revised oversight framework, that quarterly when we meet with them, these issues will be on our agenda so that we begin to figure out how better to, 1, reach people so that they understand these services are available, but also then coordinate on planning on where we place priorities moving forward.
And tell me, if you could, how often do you update your outreach plan? Is there an annual strategic planning process? Is there a review of where you've been most successful, where you've not been most successful? What research informs that plan, and who is a part of building that plan?
We work very closely with military community outreach, which is partially military one source, but also public affairs, and not only our awareness campaigns, but in looking back at our prevention plan, both primary, secondary, and tertiary prevention, to include communications and outreach. It's all part and parcel of a comprehensive planning that takes place with the services and with the other components that we are involved with under the umbrella of military, community, and family policy. And all of that work is happening now. We expect that in the prevention work that we're doing at the DoD level with other components that address violence and harmful behaviors, that comprehensive communication strategies and outreach strategies certainly will have to be a part of prevention. So that work is continuing, and I expect that within the next year or so, we would have a comprehensive plan that speaks to communications, outreach, and using the CDC's socio-ecological model to address primary prevention.
So the plan that you say will be ready in about a year or two, are you updating an existing plan?
Part of that work is to update an existing plan. That plan was in place 2014 to 2018. We continue to use components of it moving forward as we plan either for new policy, new practice and standards, or for a strategic plan.
So am I understanding you update it every 4 years? Is that what you're saying?
To my knowledge, the prevention plan was for 5 years, and now we are looking at making decisions about whether we will do another one for 5 years, whether that time frame needs to be different, or whether we need to change our strategy and look at creating a prevention policy, including communications and outreach, or whether that would need to be standards that are brought into DoD policy as well.
Do you know in the existing plan, as well as the plan that you are now proactively working on, what role do survivors play in informing that plan?
Based upon my knowledge, that is some significant work that remains to be done. I know that at the service level, they have held focus groups to understand better about what survivors and families need in order to address domestic abuse. Again, that is done installation to installation. It is not policy that DoD imposes on them.
My time is about to expire. I would offer a recommendation. The recommendation is that this process, this planning, be survivor-centric. That means their voices have to be predominant in the planning phase. That means their experiences need to be heard so that you all are able to more adequately be a presence there for them. They need you. They need the services that you provide. They need the outreach. And the only way we're going to fix this is if you listen to them.
Thank you, and we will take that back.
Thank you. My time has expired.
Thank you, Ms. Escobar. Mr. Kelly.
I just, one further suggestion. Exit surveys, whether it's through separation, divorce, separation from service, I think you could gain a lot of information if you did exit surveys with spouses and children when they leave the service, especially when they do it separate from the service member. I think you could get a lot of helpful information, and with that, I yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Kelly. Mrs. Johnston, Mr. Noyes, thank you very much for participating in this hearing. I think you've heard loud and clear that there's a lot of work that needs to be done. I realize that you are an umbrella entity, but you do meet quarterly with each of the services. I am frankly sick and tired that we have each service having a different set of standards and ways of providing services to their service members and families. I think there should be some consistency across all the services. But having said that, as you meet with them, I think it's going to be important for you to ask them to do a comprehensive drill down on what the needs are as it relates to domestic violence. I understand that you provide all kinds of other services under FAP, but specifically as it relates to domestic violence. One of the things we heard was that service members will oftentimes isolate their spouse and not offer their emails for communication purposes. We've got to find a way around that. You've got to be able to use email or Facebook or any number of other opportunities that exist on these various bases to communicate with these families. And certainly your FAP programs at each of the services can identify how to do that, but that's got to be one of the first steps that I think you undertake in order to be able to communicate better and give more information to the community that exists. So with that, we'll stand adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you.